All right, good morning, everybody. All right, we'll go ahead and get started and call to order the July 24th, 2020 meeting of the Fair Political Practices Commission. Ms. Linker, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Cardenas? Commissioner Hatch? Commissioner Hatch, can you hear us? No. Commissioner Hayward?
Here.
Commissioner Wilson?
Here.
Chair Matich?
Here. Well, good morning, everyone. Before we proceed to public comment, I did have some sad news I wanted to share with folks. On July 8th, former executive director of our commission, Wayne Ordos, passed away after a battle with a long illness. Hang on a second, Commissioner Hatch. Mr. Ordos also represented a number of clients before our body. I had the good fortune of meeting him on a few occasions, and I will be left with his sense of humor and certainly a gregarious personality. So I wanted to offer our condolences to his family and sympathies to his friends as well. Do any other commissioners have any opening remarks they wanted to make before we proceed to public comment? Commissioner Hatch, I see you waving your hand.
Can I be heard?
Commissioner Hatch, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. We will proceed then with public comment. Do we have any public comment for items not on the agenda?
Yes. Hello?
Go ahead.
Yes, my name is Steve Petzold. I live in Santa Clarita, California. I wanted to talk to you this morning about stipulation 17.287 that you approved at the June meeting. I filed that complaint and I was not notified that it was not on that it was on your agenda. The stipulation was on your agenda for approval until a week after you had already approved it. I put a significant amount of time into that, and had I had the opportunity to review the stipulation, I would have probably opposed it and given public comment to that effect. Disappointed in the investigation, I found it very disheartening that within the stipulation itself, it said, in the interest of settlement, they decided not to fully investigate the conflict of interest between the committee and the foundation. I find that very difficult to believe. That's where the meat of the issue was. It isn't in trying to figure out what date was this sent in and what date was that sent in. It's in trying to determine the conflicts of interest between the college, the foundation, and the committee. Wanted to point out that within the stipulation, it said that there was only one major donor, that was Lundgren Management. Lundgren Management had been awarded a contract to build a science center that was dependent on the passage of Measure E. Prior to the election, they made donations totaling $49,950, keeping them $50 below the limit that would have required them to be put on the advertising material as a major donor. After the election, that is after the results were known, Lundgren Management came in with another $60,000, making their total contributions $109,950. I believe that's noteworthy to you as the FPPC because it shows a way that people can get around or skate around being a major donor by just going up to the limit and then waiting until after the campaign to donate more money. I believe that shows deceitful behavior by the committee. I also had submitted a number of follow-up complaints to the original complaint that I had been told would be incorporated into the original complaint. I have given you a list of those on a written comment that I submitted. One of these was regarding the principal officer, the name of the principal officer put on the Form 410. I believe that Robert McCarty was nothing more than a figurehead, and he didn't qualify as a principal officer. The principal officer of a committee is the individual responsible for approving the political activity of the committee. I'll save the rest of the definition, but there certainly was at least one more person that should have been put on the form as a principal officer, and that person's name is Brian Kegel, an attorney to the chancellor of the college, who in a complaint against Westfield LLC for providing space to the committee said that he had negotiated the lease. I do not see Mr. McCarty's signature on anything or that would show that he was the principal officer other than the treasurer. I sure would have liked to have seen the committee ask for a copy of the contract with TBWB that I believe was instrumental in running the campaign. In short, I'm very disappointed that I was not notified. I believe that the investigator left you unclear as to what the full extent of the illegal activity by the committee and the foundation was. And at that point, I'll round this up. I also had comment regarding agenda item 5, which I understand you're going to pull. So do you want me to wait to comment on that until then or now?
Yes, my understanding is that that item will be pulled, and so you can provide your public comment on that item at the time it returns to the commission at that time. So please conclude your comments. You've already exceeded the public comment period.
Well, I'm glad that the commission pulled that item, and I hope the enforcement division will go forward and fully investigate the situation between the college, the foundation, and the committee. I believe that they were not thorough in their investigation, and that's why I asked for you to pull it, and I understand the enforcement division is going to review it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your comments. Do we have any further public comment for items not on the agenda? Hearing and seeing none, we'll go ahead and proceed to item number 2, approval of the June 2020 commission hearing minutes. Do any commissioners have edits or comments for the hearing minutes? Hearing and seeing none, do we have any public comment on the hearing minutes? Do any commissioners have edits or comments for the hearing minutes? Hearing and seeing none, do we have a motion?
I'll move approval.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Second, Commissioner Wilson. Ms. Blinker?
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you. We'll now proceed to our enforcement consent calendar. This is items 3 through 10. Before we move on with that, though, item 5, as I just alluded to, and item 7, at the request of enforcement, our chief of enforcement, we are going to pull those from today's agenda, and those will be renoticed at a subsequent agenda. I also understand that Commissioner Wilson may wish to speak on this.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Matich. I'm respectfully requesting that item 4 be removed from the consent calendar. I have no financial interest in this matter, but in an abundance of caution, I'm going to recuse myself. I have a family member who has worked on a research project with the respondent, and because of that interaction, in an abundance of caution, I will recuse myself on this item. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wilson. All right, at this time then, I would suggest that we proceed with
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Hatch, yes. Commissioner Hatch, your audio needs, thank you.
I also would like to recuse myself on item 6. West Covina firefighters are long known to me and were part of the umbrella group that I represented. And so I would, although I don't see a legal conflict of interest, out of an abundance of caution, I would like to recuse myself from that item.
All right. Then why don't we go ahead and proceed then with, as our commission, items 3, 8, 9, and 10. And then we will proceed with voting on the matters where we have recusals after that. So that's 3, 8, 9, and 10. Do any commissioners have comments on those matters on our consent calendar? Any public comment on those matters? Any commissioners have comments? Do we have a motion on those matters on our consent calendar?
I'll move approval.
Second?
Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Chair Manich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you. At this time, we'll take up item number 4. Commissioner Wilson will step out of the hearing room. Do any commissioners have comments on item number 4 or discussion for item 4? Hearing none, do we have any public comment on item 4? Hearing and seeing none, Ms. Linker? Oh, sorry, do we have a motion?
I move the adoption of item 4.
Second.
Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Chair Manich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you. We'll welcome Commissioner Wilson back. We'll now proceed to item number 6. Commissioner Hatch, go ahead and maybe just turn off your video.
I don't know how I turn off my video, but I'm welcome at being turned off.
All right, we're gonna put you in the virtual waiting room, Commissioner Hatch. Just there you go. Bye-bye. All right, we will now take up item number 6. Do any commissioners have questions or comments on item 6? Hearing and seeing none, do we have any public comment on item number 6? Hearing and seeing none, do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Second, Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Chair Manich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and welcome back Commissioner Hatch now. And there he is. All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll go ahead and proceed then to item number 11. This is our pre-notice discussion of proposed amendment to the Enforcement Division Streamline and Warning Letter Programs. So regulations 18360.1 and 18360.2, and a new Tier 2 Streamline program, which would be regulation 18360.3. I believe we have Chief of Enforcement West here to present this item to us. Good morning, Ms. West.
Good morning.
Please proceed.
Okay, so today we're presenting the new Tier 2 Streamline program. And since it seems very complicated and there's so many violations, what we decided to do was come up with a PowerPoint to kind of show each violation. Sasha sent you the PowerPoint and it'll be posted on our website, but what we're really hoping to do is present the policy questions for the commission to narrow it down as to what direction we need moving into adoption, and then also go through each violation so that you have an understanding on how this would work. So Jesse, if you want to run the PowerPoint. Since I don't know how to share my screen, IT is going to do it. Okay, so I supposedly can do this now. 1 second. Haha. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, terrific. So basically, as the memo states, and you all know, the Streamline program has been in form with the commission and since about 1999, and it's taken on different iterations. And it started off as just late contribution reports and major donor reports, because those were identified as something that could be given a criteria and applied through a faster process. And just to give the origin story, we have a private attorney general action statute under the act. And since these are easily identifiable violations by looking at campaign statements, what would happen is the public could look at a campaign statement, find a major donor, and then file a civil lawsuit against them. And if they did that in bulk, the enforcement division couldn't react in time in order for, and do a mainline stipulation in time in order for them not to be able to sue civilly. So it became an issue for lots of major donors that maybe weren't even notified that they had a filing requirement. And so that was kind of the birth of streamlined programs in order to have an expedited way to handle certain cases. So as this has progressed, in 2015, we did a revision to the Streamline program where we added some other areas that also could be identified by criteria that could be applied to expedite the handling of cases. And how enforcement has made recommendations over the years as to what should be added to the Streamline programs is based on when the commission gives guidance as to what they want us to spend the resources on. What are the egregious violations? What is the most public harm? What should we really be looking at? Those are the ones that we want to be able to spend the time in, and should be the mainline stipulations that have the entire story, that have the exposure of that, and have negotiated language that everyone agrees on. Everything else should be able to be handled in a more expedited way. And that's what we're proposing today, is to have a second tier to the Streamline program that not necessarily is for the issues that have already been prosecuted under tier 1, and then they progress to tier 2. It's actually a different program altogether. And as you'll see through this PowerPoint, it's really about taking some violations that are currently being pushed into the mainline program because the tier 1 criteria are very strict, and having a tier 2 program that these can be handled in an expedited way, but with higher penalties and somewhat detailed streamlined stipulations. So the information is still given to the public, the prosecutions can be handled more quickly, and the fines are more commensurate to a tier 2 violation. So what we found is that our amount of streamlined cases that we used to do under the 2015 program that were presented to the commission was about 77% of all the stipulations presented to the commission per year. And since the new regulations have gone into effect, that's gone down to about 66%. So we're thinking that this tier 2 program will still allow the commission to have the strict tier 1 program that does exclude people, but it will then have a tier 2 program that will then capture most of these. So that's kind of the basis of why we're proposing these changes. So as you can see, the policy decisions, what I've identified are the 4 main areas of change that the commission will need to give enforcement guidance on as we move forward to adoption of these regulations. So the first one is, should major donor committees and behested payment reporting be added? And if so, how strict should those criteria be? So these are 2 more areas that we've identified as very susceptible to having criteria applied equally in order to get a result that would be consistent. So that's why we're proposing those. And major donors especially, we have back in the beginning, as I said, major donors were their own category. In the 2015 change, what enforcement proposed and what was adopted by the commission was that we include major donor committees in just a general non-filer of campaign statements, late filer of campaign statements. And what we found is that major donors are so unique that they should be handled differently because they do terminate each year. They could not be notified of their filing requirements, and they're just different than a recipient committee that's been established. So that's why they've been suggested to be included in their own category. The HESTED payment reporting, as I said in the memo, has been on the rise. We receive many more referrals and complaints about the HESTED payment reporting than ever. And since there's been many discussions about the HESTED payment reporting, we thought presenting it to the commission to get a guideline of criteria that the commission agrees should be applied in these cases would be the best practice going forward to consistently handle these cases and make sure that we're treating everybody exactly the same. So the second bullet is, should the percentage added to the percentage, sorry, I'm gonna cough. Should the percentage added to the penalty increase based on how early the respondent participates in the settlement? One of the changes that we're proposing is that we still keep the percentage that says, if you didn't file your report within 7 days of the election, then it will go up to 3%. Because we think that there should be a penalty as it gets closer to the election that makes it sting a little more to make you remember those are very important reports, because the last 16 days of the election, there's no other reporting. But the other percentage, the one that we're talking about here, is we put into the change that a percentage be added as you go through the process. So if you settle early, it's a 1% addition to the penalty as to what the total amount unreported was. But as you go through, this can go up to 4% to incentivize you to participate in the process earlier. What we have found in the past year and a half is that this has it's affected more greatly the unrepresented people. So the represented people aren't really affected by this. They generally get their attorney involved and we come to a resolution pretty quickly. What we've seen is unrepresented individuals who tend to want to just stick their head in the sand early on and say, gosh, I hope this goes away, then get dinged with a higher percentage later because then they haven't participated in the process. So what we're proposing is maybe this isn't actually affecting people equally. So we were going to propose to reduce it all to just 1%. Then for the third criteria, how strict should the criteria be to exclude cases by population of jurisdiction and 24-hour reports not filed timely? These are the two areas that we've identified exclude the most cases from the Streamline program. So what we've proposed is to have the tier 2 violations include a lot of the cases that would be excluded from these tier 1 criteria, and to be able to capture a lot more under tier 2, but with the commensurate fines that the commission would generally see. So as you'll see through the slideshow, we've looked at cases that have been prosecuted in other hypothetical scenarios. And what we've seen is the fines are a little bit lower under tier 2 than they would be in a main line, but generally they're about on par, which brings me to the last point, which is, does the commission agree that the penalties for the tier 2 should be higher when the criteria for participation in the tier 2 program is more generous? And what I mean by this is that sometimes the criteria is very similar to the tier 1 criteria, but it just includes maybe a little tweak here or there. And that would be something like the SCI filers program. Not too much difference between the tiers. But when you get to cash or gifts, something like that, then if it's not reported on your campaign statement, then you're excluded. And the gifts, if there's somebody with jurisdiction, with business in your jurisdiction that could come before you, you're excluded from the tier 1 program. And if we include these big categories into tier 2, we're proposing that the penalties in tier 2 for those violations would be higher than just a normal progression from tier 1. So then that way we're including some violations that could be considered a little more harm, but we're making the penalties more commensurate with that as opposed to just doing steps. So these are the 4 points that I'll be hitting on as we go through the slides. Does anybody have general questions or comments before we get into each type?
Commissioner Wilson, do you have a question?
Yeah, just one quick question. Thank you, Chief of Enforcement West. But I have one quick question, and I think you did a very good job providing an overview. But what would be the ramifications if we don't go to the second tier? You touched on that.
Adopt it? Is that what you mean?
Yes. Well, not necessarily not adopt it, but let's say we didn't implement it at this time. What would be the ramifications?
Sure. And I think what I would propose, if that was the commission was not interested in doing a two-tier approach, would be the loosening of some of the criteria that have excluded some smaller committees from participating in the streamlined process that have been able to participate over the years. And what I found when I was looking into that was every time we loosened the rules for tier 1 too much, then you had some committees that were getting a $200 or $100 penalty that really shouldn't be. And so by creating the tier 2, what the hope is that then we would be able to address that. We'd be able to say, okay, tier 1 really is for these minor violations, and tier 2 is for behavior that is more than the minor violations. So if we didn't adopt the tier 2, then I would make suggestions on amending tier 1 or the existing program.
Okay, thank you.
Other Commissioner Hatch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend Galena and her staff on the development of this proposal before us. I think I would note that the creation of a second tier as opposed to stretching the existing program is a very, very good check on all of us, because it will allow us to receive reports periodically of which kinds of violations are being, which offenses are being handled in tier 2 and which are being handled in tier 1, to give us an idea of the impact of what we've voted to do. There are a couple of basic issues that I do take exception to. I've communicated those I think it was earlier this week to Galena, and I would just indicate that she's responded back that she'd be happy to try and figure out what of those suggestions could be incorporated. And based on our past work in this area before, I have a high degree of faith in her ability to resolve the issues, and also her willingness to try and do what's right. I would be remiss though if I didn't at least indicate the nature of the concerns. The percentage added based upon how long in the process the person drags this out is one that I think is important to keep. And so my list of amendments are a whole bunch of those little edits that would restore the regulations to what they were at the time relative to the added on percentage, depending upon how long in the process you drug this out. So I gotta figure out how to get to my notes behind this thing. I'm gonna exit full screen. Let's see. Oh, the maintaining of the population-based limits. Embedded in this proposal is a proposed to eliminate, I think it's 4 or 5 of the bottom population brackets for eligibility into Streamline. I would just like to give you a little historical background on this. When we were working on the last major revision of Streamline, we were confronted with concerns expressed by the called the White Hat organizations that they didn't like the increased financial thresholds that would apply to these Streamline cases. And I know that I was personally involved in negotiating with Clean Money campaign to try and stretch this a little on the bigger cases. Essentially what you had was Streamline was only impacting small campaigns and pretty technical, nearly non-substantive offenses. And so if you're in a statewide campaign of any kind, there's no hope in the world that you would ever be eligible for the original Streamline. And so we negotiated this stretch, this this stair step of limits to be eligible based on the population that's represented in the campaign. So if it's a city council campaign, you look at the population of the city, or if it's the same city with district voting, you look at the population of the districts of the council members that are representing that area. To assembly districts, county elections, school district elections, all these would be seen through this stair step of population brackets that would determine whether or not you're eligible to go into Streamline, but would now be Streamline 1, which was just simply Streamline before. And so there's some sensitivity. I looked at it kind of both ways and thought if you would just reinstate one of the brackets, because right now you have from population 10, or I should say 0, all the way up to, I think it's 150,000 population, or almost 200,000 population under the proposal. And I would ask that we leave the bracket that would be now the new bottom, to take it down to those under around 50,000. I can't find my oh, I think here.
Commissioner Hatch, this is Galena. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a slide on that where I've actually shown what your proposed change is.
Oh, okay.
If you want to wait, then all the numbers are on there.
Okay, great. I would like to ask, though, a couple of questions before I leave this general description. One is, it's not clear to me if we have institutionalized when a person is notified of their eligibility for Streamline. Is it when they get the first letter telling them that they have violations of the act, or is it at some subsequent time? And if so, do we let them know that they have the right to consult an attorney about this, and what the importance is of responding quickly in terms of how it would affect their fine under the Streamline program? Could you kind of educate me on that?
Sure. It's not when the complaint or referral is first received, because we have to look into it, make sure that it's a good complaint, good referral, all the information is correct, and there's nothing else to worry about with the case. But we do have a standardized letter that goes out via email, usually if we have a good email, and it explains what the Streamline program is and that they qualify and what their proposed penalty would be under the Streamline program. It gives them a contact person and tells them what other rights that they have.
But that's not at the time they're charged, is that correct?
Charged, yes, that is the first contact. So charging as in like probable cause is much later.
No, I don't mean probable cause. I mean, they're notified that
Allegations?
they're in violation of certain infractions of our rules.
So they get a notification that we've received a complaint or referral about them
Mhm.
with a copy of that, so that they have the information as to what's being alleged. But since we haven't even validated that information yet, we don't make an offer for settlement at that time.
No, but at some point we let them know that we're going to charge them, or we are charging them, correct? I don't know.
Sure. Sure. Statements of economic interest would be the fastest, because we would get a referral saying that this person didn't file. And so we would contact them and say, your filing officer has referred this to you and said that you've been contacted by them several times. And so under the Political Reform Act, there's a Streamline program. And so you would need to do the following things. You need to file your statement or show us proof that you filed the statement, provide us any information, and then here's what the proposed penalty would be if you are filing it late. Does that answer your question?
I'm not exactly sure. When is it that, see, the first contact that you were speaking of, that's just to let you know, or let me know if I were the person being looked at, that someone has made a complaint. It doesn't
Correct.
tell you that we believe any of those things, allegations are true.
Correct.
But at some other point, we send them a notice that, yeah, we do have some things that we're going to pursue against you. What do they call that letter?
It depends on the case. If it's a campaign statement that's missing, we call it a 30-day letter, which says within 30 days, you need to file these statements that are missing. Call us, work with us, whatever, because we can't give them a settlement offer until they file the statements because of the percentages. So we get their cooperation first and get their filings up to date. And then we talk to them about settlement from there.
I see. And do we, going back to the first notice letter where you're just letting them know that someone's made a complaint, do we introduce them to the concept of Streamline at that point?
We do not.
We do not. Could we not give them a general indication that if they've complied with the requirements, they may be eligible for Streamline, and it would, some brief description of what that means to them so that they would be tuned into that.
Sure, I would have to review the 30-day letter, but I know that the statement of economics interest letter does refer to the Streamline program at that point.
Yeah.
But I would have to review the 30-day letter to see if it's written in there. But the notification that we've received a complaint against you does not. And since we don't even know what the case will turn into at that point, I wouldn't want to mislead anyone.
I understand that, but part of your presentation is that most of the people who get the higher fines are people who, as you said, bury their head in the sand. But it seems to me that maybe we could be a little bit more proactive in terms of educating them about the possibility of having reduced fines or more modest fines if they cooperate in the Streamline program. And I think it's important that we keep that balance. We need to educate them on the front end and also make it more painful if they avoid us and make us go through all the steps of enforcement up to including the default judgment.
Okay, I could definitely look at the notification letters and see if there's language that we can add to those.
Thank you, and then I'll hold my peace and let you continue with your slide presentation.
All right, any other commissioner comments at this point, or should we allow Ms. West to continue her presentation?
In abundance of time, I do have one quick point to make.
Please, Commissioner Wilson.
Thank you, Ms. West, for outlining that level of detail. The PowerPoint presentation is very informative. At some point, if this is implemented, we could do what the commission staff has done an excellent job in doing and have a training video, training information, so that the public and those impacted will have all the detailed information they need on the new program if we go to a second tier. So just something to consider.
Completely agree with you, Commissioner Wilson. In fact, the analyst that put this together, Dominika Łażanska, who I couldn't have done this without, she had already suggested training slides for the website and also for people to be able to send out to respondents so that they could have an understanding and not have to try to wade through the regulations. I completely agree.
Okay, thank you.
Great. All right, Ms. West.
All right. So I've identified what the major points are that the commission will give guidance on. This is just a slide showing you what is currently in the program and then the 2 additions to the program. Sorry, I have a little cough today, so my voice cracks. It's not weird. Okay, so when we're looking at the overall exclusions, all we did was we took the current program, which is on the left, and we took out that they had a prior penalty within the last 5 years, and they have a history of not filing the statements or reports. And we put that as, that is something that excludes you from tier 1, but doesn't exclude you from tier 2. So then when you look at the specific exclusions, and I'm going to go pretty quickly through these just to kind of highlight some things because I know it's an excessive amount of slides. So please interrupt if there's specifics that you need more information about. And then we'll slow down when we get to the population and 24-hour reporting, which Commissioner Hatch has raised issues about. So the exclusions from the current program was that they, then this is for a late filed SEI, that they had a conflict of interest violation. And and the exclusions from tier 1 was the undisclosed economic interest was a source that was regulated. And now for tier 2, you've paid a tier 1 penalty or received a warning letter in the last 5 years. And the undisclosed interests were from a source that was regulated, but it did not cause you a conflict. So all we're doing is expanding a little. And so then that way there's more activity captured in tier 2. And in this case, it's going to be the undisclosed economic interest was from a source that was regulated by or had business before the filer's agency. Still be excluded from the lower penalties. So then if you look at the penalties, tier 2 is a lot higher than tier 1 because you're getting to participate in a program even though the economic interest had business before your entity. So since we consider that to be a egregious thing to do, then we want to be able to not just go from 200 to 400. We want to have the penalty jump up more. So that's what I meant in the last bullet, where the penalties for tier 2 have been tried to mimic how much is included in the tier 2 criteria.
So Ms. West, can I ask a question real quick?
Sure.
Just to clarify something. So the first exclusion, and I'm looking at exclusion eligibility, late statements of economic interest. eligibility tier 2, you're excluded from tier 2, as I understand this, if you paid a tier 1 penalty or received a warning letter for the same type of violation occurring within the last 5 years. So you're excluded from tier 2 if those circumstances exist, right?
Right.
Could you go back into tier 1? Is there any exclusion? Could you be
Can
a
you say your
repeat
question
offender and
again? I'm
find
sorry, I couldn't hear you clearly.
Yeah, if you were a repeat offender under tier 1, could you go back into tier 1 under this? Because the exclusion applies to tier 2 here. But could you stay in tier 1 again?
No,
You already
'cause
had a warning letter?
the general exclusion, well, warning letters are different, so you could still get a tier 1 if you got a warning letter. But the general exclusion for tier 1 is you can't have had a tier 1 prosecution. So
Okay.
tier 2 is just taking that and saying, if you have, if you've had that, and if that's not specific in the regulation, I will make sure that it is. But tier 2 is just allowing a tier 1 prosecution to go into tier 2.
Okay.
But I will double check the language of the regulation to make sure it says that.
Okay. All right. I just want to make sure I was following.
Yeah, and I talked very quickly. Okay. So then that gets us to unreported economic interests. And I should note that we have made the unreported economic interest already had that as excluded if it had an undisclosed gift or income received from a source that's regulated. And we're adding that to the general SEI section, which is in the current law just based on an oversight. But we've been enforcing that based on the public harm. So that is just a clarification, making sure that that got added in. So this one, we're just changing economic interest because we realized that it was just limited to gifts or income causing a conflict of interest. And so we want to make sure that we change that. And then tier 2, the undisclosed economic interest cause a conflict. And that still excludes you, but the undisclosed gift or income was from a source that's regulated. So it's identical to the late filed SEI. And again, these fines seem very high, but when you look at it, this is not reporting an economic interest that was regulated by the entity that you're on. So letting you know about that. And then moving to unreported contributions or expenditures, you'll note that I have skipped late filed campaign statements because I'm putting those at the end with all the population. It's a more detailed discussion. So exclusions for unreported contributions, the current program has a 20% threshold in it. And we've run into great problems with smaller campaigns because of the 20% threshold. Because when you have a campaign that's $4,000, and a 20% can creep up on you pretty quickly. And so what we're proposing is to eliminate the 20% and then change it to the total amount unreported is greater than the applicable population base limit, which seems to be a fair resolution since that's what the late filing of the campaign statement is for. So if that's a standard for late filing campaign statements, it should also be the standard for the unreported contributions and expenditures, which is similar to the SEI and the unreported SEI. So then the tier 2 would then say it's above that population limit, but it's less than $100,000. $100,000 seems like a big number. That's the top of the population scale. So I would encourage, if the commission is uncomfortable with the $100,000 level as being too high, then we would need to look at the population scale because it does go up to $100,000 of activity. And whatever changes that we make there, we would make throughout. So just so you know, that would be kind of a trickle down change.
Yeah, on that slide,
Mm-hmm.
in my life, what it would amount to is a very small population community, say 400 people, there are some that small, would be subject to the $100,000 limit. which is the root of the problem we had with the white hat organizations, that it would just encourage escalation of, in their view, escalation of campaign spending in small communities. And they wanted to, they understood what we were trying to say. If the bigger campaigns like in LA County or an assembly or a Senate race or even a statewide race, it needs to be higher than those really very tiny limits that were in the original streamline. But they freaked at much smaller numbers than 100,000 that would apply to these small communities. And I would just implore you to consider trying to stay as true to that as you could, with the caveat that some of them are so small. And I think that at least 2 of the small brackets could be, what do you call it, folded into the next bracket, but not quite as high up as your staff analysis would propose. Sorry for the interruption.
That's okay. And I totally agree with you. I think the 100,000 on this slide is a startling number, but I think that it's because the thresholds go up too high. And I realize that state campaigns are large. And in my first try at this, I, in response to the white hat organizations, was making the difference state and local, which when they considered LA County and some water boards, they're like, then that's way too low. But it actually more addressed the problem as opposed to $100,000 of activity to no matter what size the campaign is. So, I mean, maybe the discussion when we get to the population threshold should talk about getting rid of the top of the population threshold as well, but we'll see how it goes.
Okay.
Ms. West, at this point, can I ask you, just for the sake of the public and perhaps other commissioners who may not be aware of this, but there is no entitlement to streamline. I mean, I think we need to take a step back, and just because somebody may qualify for streamline, even under these proposed changes, unless I'm missing something, you, as the chief of enforcement, have the discretion on a case-by-case basis to determine whether the public harm weighs in favor of not permitting streamline. So when we're talking about these population numbers, and we're talking about ratcheting penalties on a very fixed, lockstep type of a structure, what we're really doing is, in some ways, we're taking away discretion from enforcement. But under the regs, you do have that discretion to pull a case out of streamline. And so I know 100,000 strikes, folks, is a high number, but just bear in mind, if you were to determine that there's some overriding public harm there, they don't have an entitlement to it if you determine otherwise. That's correct, right?
That is absolutely correct, and that's a great point. Also, intentional behavior is automatically excluded, and yes, it's a compilation of the public harm in the entirety of the case. So we definitely take all of that into consideration for excluding from streamline.
All right, thanks. I just think that's important context for everyone to keep in mind.
Okay, so then talking about the penalties for unreported contributions. So these are the penalties for 1% is the amount that is normally attributed, and then 3% is the higher amount as you get closer to the election. So we're proposing those to stay in, but not be progressive as it goes through the process. And then here's an example, a case summary about an unsuccessful candidate in a local election where the committee size was 16,000 and they failed to accurately disclose on their first pre-election, but amended before the election. But the total amount unreported was more than 20%. And so it was excluded from streamline. So mainline, we approved a penalty of $1,000. And under this program, it would be $157 streamline by getting rid of the percentage. And I think one of the big factors that should be noted in this example is that they did amend before the election. So we want to make sure that that kind of behavior gets included in these kind of programs. At least I do. I shouldn't say we. But, okay, so then late lobbying reporting, the big difference is right now in the current rule, it's just one flat threshold at 100,000. But in the proposal, it would first limit it at 50,000 in tier 1 and 100,000 in tier 2. And you would still be excluded if you tried to hide it. And if it included a campaign contribution. So those would remain as the exclusions from the program. And then the penalties, as we talked about before, the 1%. And then unreported lobbying activity would be the same change to be consistent, and the same change here. So then cash contributions. So this is a bigger change because the exclusions would still retain the 25% threshold that we have in the original, which means that the percentage of the cash contributions and expenditures of $100 or more exceeded 25% for that reporting period. So you see this a lot in smaller campaigns, especially when they're using their own money, because then they will just pay cash to vendors out of their own money. And so you would retain that under tier 1. The exclusion for tier 2 would still be if anybody had personal use of the campaign funds. But then we would have this other bracket where if they failed to disclose that cash and it was $1,000 or less for that statement of report, they'd still be eligible. Because you see this sometimes where they paid something that was $300, they didn't put it on their campaign statement, and then it's mainline because it has not qualified. And then we have a percentage, 25% to 50% for tier 2. So since this is generous, the penalty, and then there's a limit, sorry, the total amount is 10,000, but it's less than 25,000, so that nothing over 25,000 will be eligible for either program. But then you see that these fines are higher because it's 50% of the amount of cash as the starter for tier 2, because generally cash contributions are treated rather severely by the commission. So we wanted to make sure that that was reflected in tier 2. So they weren't being taken lightly. They were just handled in a more expedited way. So all these changes are trying to reflect the direction that the commission has given on each individual violation. So then for campaign bank accounts, very similar, where there's the percentage, as long as it doesn't breach $10,000, no personal use of the campaign funds, and campaign records are insufficient to determine if there was another account concealing the violations. So then that way, if there's funny business going on, they're not going to be able to have a streamlined penalty, basically, to put it in layman's terms. And then we're going up to the 40% threshold for tier 2, and it's 10,000 but less than 25. So then when you look at these penalties, they have jumped up from 100 to 400 because we want to make sure that it's commensurate with how the commission has been handling these violations. And then committee naming, which is a big one. The exclusion from proposed tier 2 will always be the name was intentionally misleading or ambiguous. But the tier 2 will now be able to have the incorrect name cause the advertisements to be incorrect, because you see this with a lot of smaller committees where they name their committee something short and cute with a little bit of information in it about the election, but it's not correct. And so then they use that name in all their advertisements. And this has been causing them to not be able to participate in the Streamline program. And of course, that this would be taken in consideration as to if it was confusing, if it was misleading, ambiguous, if it was intentionally that way. Any of those things are going to get you excluded. And then the incorrect name failed to disclose the single major donor contributor, major donor sponsor, and had activity 10,000 to 50,000 during the time that the committee name was incorrect. And that's a big one for the exclusion of tier 1. And as you see, then the penalties jump up because now you were spending a lot during the time that your committee name was wrong. So we wanted the tier 2 penalty to jump up significantly. And then as for advertising and mass mailing, most of these changes are just to make it clearer, because as we were trying to use the committee naming section with the advertising section, there was some confusion on how they work together. So these are more clarifications. So for the exclusion from tier 1, we added whether the advertisement is an independent expenditure or authorized. So we don't want confusion regarding that to be able to get the $100 penalty in tier 1. And then they raised and spend less than $25,000. So this was a direct result of some of the cases that you've seen over the past year and a half, where these very small independent expenditure committees were getting their advertisement wrong because they were ignorant of the requirements. They raised and spent very little money, and they were just they just put their name on it, or they just put some name they made up, but all of their information. So we are trying to address that situation because it was noted by several commissioners during the year that they found it odd that these were mainline prosecutions. So we wanted to make sure that that was addressed. And then this is kind of a cleanup of tier 1, tier 2, where we're trying to talk about the committee name requirement and the interplay between the two sections. And then this is the consistency change. And then record keeping. So with record keeping, we really wanted to be able to include more in tier 2 eligibility. So it seems pretty harsh because I mean, pretty lax, because you're including inadvertent or negligent lack of record keeping and inhibited audit efforts, and that's huge. But when you look at the penalties, we've increased the penalties threefold for the first violation and twofold for the second violation, because we wanted to make sure that it was commensurate with record keeping efforts. And generally in mainline, record keeping is either a $1,000 or $1,500 penalty, or for the life of the committee, and this would be per reporting period. And also it would be so it would also be at this higher rate. So we would be able to address record keeping instead of using it as aggravation in mainline. Gift limit is another big one, because it's about the gift giver being the named party and subject of something before the recipient's agency, but without a conflict. So it's similar to the other change that we had talked about for consistency. And then failure to report is the exclusion for tier 1, but not the exclusion for tier 2. But so since this is very generous, because you didn't report it on your SCI, they may have had business before your agency, but didn't cause a conflict. The penalties are commensurate with that, to where they don't just jump up to 400, they jump up to 600. So, and all of these penalties were calculations based on the difference between main lines and streamlines, and what the commission direction is on each type of violation. So they're obviously numbers that we can talk about and work out to get correct, but we do have examples to show how these violations would end up, because what we have found is that there's generally not a lot of cases with just one violation that aren't late filers. So when you have one of these violations, you generally have 2 or 3 more, and the amount in streamline fine goes up significantly. So this is the new major donor filers. As you can tell, we're getting close to the end. So what we're proposing, from looking at all of the major donor cases that we've had, would be for tier 1, it would be capped at 50,000. The contributions also required 24-hour reports to be filed within the last 16 days. And the recipient of the contribution did not file it before the election. So basically what we're saying, because most major donor filers, if they didn't file their semi-annual, they didn't file a 24-hour report as well. So what we're saying is that if the recipient of the contribution did file a 24-hour report before the election, then you're still going to qualify under Tier 1. The exclusion for Tier 2 was the report was missing, was due within the last 16 days, and was not disclosed on a 24-hour report before the relevant election. So it's, we wanted to make sure that if there was no disclosure in the last 16 days, I'm trying to think, and then the Tier 2 would be limited at 150,000 and less than 3 statements during that calendar year. So if there's 4 24-hour reports missing, they wouldn't be eligible for Streamline. And then there's the penalty structure.
Excuse me, before you go, could you put
Sure.
that back? That
Sure.
last slide.
This one?
This is representative of the schematic for most all these that I've seen up here. And I just wanted to highlight for you where it's side by side here that if you, the top line is if you promptly cooperate and get the streamline done. The bottom is if you let us go to the tail end of the process where we may impose, we call it a
Default?
judgment. Thank you. For the most cooperative, it's a doubling. And then when you get to the next line, it's about 40%, it's about 80%, excuse me. And progresses to where at the worst, at the bottom of the chart, 1,000 goes to 1,400, which is a 40% increase. And I had made suggestions for you to consider where we make these consistent as to the percentage increase. And we, in some cases, required to make one smaller and the other one larger. But you can see the disparity here. This progressively, the least cooperative and the longer it takes you to get to the conclusion, the better break you get in Tier 2 as opposed to Tier 1. And they should be consistent. And that's enough said about that.
Sure, I understand it. And the way that we had proposed it was basically just going up to $100 as the Tier 1 does.
Right,
So,
but it has an effect to make it a better deal for the people who are least cooperative.
that's true.
And I made some specific suggestions about how each of those could be adjusted so that they're internally consistent, so that you're getting the same percentage bump regardless of which end of the scale you're on.
I understand. It really just depends on what we're trying to do, because there's that theory of having it consistently the same percentage. And then the reason that we made these numbers the way we did was to have it commensurate with what the commission would penalize for a mainline. So we were trying to keep the numbers to where it's not necessarily this great discount to get the Tier 2 streamline. It's more of this is the commission's direction.
Right. But we don't want to incentivize bad behavior.
Sure.
So the suggestions I make in the various places are to try and be consistent.
Right.
So that the participation is streamlined to Tier 2. You're being treated the same regardless of what level of the process you
Right. I think I was just gun shy to adopt those because the commission has often looked at default amounts and said, wow, these are really high. So I was trying to keep the Tier 2 to where it didn't become an extremely high penalty to where the commission, the public, enforcement, we were all looking at it saying, how did we get here for this major donor violation or this, SEI non-filer? So that's why we were trying to keep the penalties from getting too out of hand. So that, I mean, like I said,
there's ways to serve both of those masters, and I did make suggestions for you to look at that would have that.
All right, thank you.
All right, Commissioner Wilson has a comment.
Well, I found the dialogue between Ms. West and Commissioner Hatch to be rather informative, but I do have one question for Chief of Enforcement West. Do you or does the commission have, or would the commission have the discretion to adjust the figures in Tier 2 if they thought they were too low or too high?
Yes, that's actually why I'm presenting them this way, so that you can actually see in vivid color as to what the proposed penalties would be. And then my hope is that you kind of look at it and say, oh, this seems like it's too high for this. But my suggestion to the commission is when we adjust the penalties, if we adjust the starting amount of a penalty, we make sure we look at the criteria and make sure that it's not too generous for that penalty, to where the commission is going to be disappointed that someone got a $400 penalty for something that they find egregious. So
they could be adjusted up or down depending
Yes.
on the circumstances. Okay, thank you.
That's on an individual basis, correct?
Yes, on a case-by-case basis.
no, sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you meant now during this discussion.
Well, no, I'm not. I mean, I understood the issues Mr. Hatch, Commissioner Hatch was raising, but my question went more to, so we'd be locked into these figures that we wouldn't have discretion on a case-by-case basis, or if there were extenuating circumstances where you wanted to, for example, increase the penalty under Tier 2 from, let's say, $1,400 to, let's say, $2,000, for example.
That's a great point. I'm sorry I misunderstood your question. Well, you wouldn't, as a commissioner, when we present a settlement to you, you could reject a mainline settlement to say that you, if you had 3 votes and you all decided that the penalty was incorrect. Under this proposal, I, as the enforcement chief, would have the discretion. I have proposed some language to where I would be able to take into consideration situations with extenuating circumstances so that the penalties don't get too extreme. And that language includes some of the scenarios that we run into is we receive a referral from Secretary of State for like a committee that should be administratively terminated. And we send them the notice because they haven't filed anything since 2015. And then they say, no, we'd like to keep it open. What do we need to do? And then they file everything from 2015 on. And we don't want to charge 2 semi-annuals per year from 2015 to 2020. And so this discretion would allow us to look at the behavior and see the participation in elections and take all that into consideration to decide, 1, how many counts that would be into the amount.
Oh, okay, so thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so then behested payment reports would be the other new category. So the maker of the payment is named in or subject of a governmental decision would be excluded from Tier 1. It's $50,000 or more for a single behested payment report would be excluded from Tier 1. The amount to be reported when divided by the number of officials was $50,000 or more. And that's to address the situation where 14 lawmakers send out a solicitation and a chunk of money comes in. And so each of them have to file a behested payment report for the entire amount. And we're looking at what their portion would be. So it's a little different than what their requirement is. The requirement is to file for the full amount. And then the behester has paid a prior penalty within the last 5 years, would exclude them from Tier 1. Tier 2, the maker of the payment's named before their agency or has business. It's the amount exceeds $150,000, and the amount required to be reported when divided exceeds $150,000. So these are from looking at all of the behested payment reports. We've done an analysis, and this seems to be good, solid criteria, but obviously we're open to suggestion, but this is what we have come up with based on the data. And then again, the tier 1 would start off low and then tier 2 would jump up. And then here's what we're talking about when we're talking about exclusions for the late campaign statements. So this is what Commissioner Hatch and I have been discussing. So on the left, you see what the current population thresholds are. And our proposal is to eliminate the bottom 4. So back in the day, before we started looking at Streamline to decide where we wanted to go with it and to add other categories, it was originally, I was rereading the memo from 2015 when we were proposing adding some extra categories. And we, at that time, reaffirmed the $25,000 limit. So committee does not have more than $25,000 of contributions received or expenditures made per campaign statement. Of course, it was always that no evidence of intent to conceal. They hadn't had another one in 5 years, and they came up to date with their filings. So we're trying to get closer back to that, because that $25,000 threshold really worked for most of the locals. It was, it seemed to come out with good results, and it included a lot of the smaller committees. And when we're talking to Commissioner Hatch, then his proposal would be to at least keep in the $11,700 bracket that you see in red.
Right.
And then our proposal is to also give special districts a default amount, because we've reached out to many special districts, and we've estimated that we've successfully contacted about 1,000 of them, and only really received good information from we received responses from 341, but a lot of them have said it's just impossible for them to get the data that we're looking for based on census information. And the other issue that I would bring up is the census information is from 2010. So a lot of these populations have grown since then, but we're still using those numbers. So we're looking to modify even for the current program, which is different than a lot of the other things that I've talked to you about today. This is a modification of the current program plus adding the tier 2. All right. And then this is the 24-hour report exclusions. So currently a 24-hour report required to be filed within the last 16 days and not filed before the election is only allowed to be in tier 1 if it was de minimis. And so for tier 2, we would allow it if it was under 50,000. And then
Ms. West, what's the standard for de minimis? What does that mean?
it means not much.
Well, but like, I mean in dollars.
It actually just depends on the size of the campaign. So we applied the de minimis standard based on the size of the campaign. So if you're an $8,000 campaign and it was a $3,000 24-hour report, then we don't consider that de minimis. So we do it as a percentage.
All right.
And then more exclusions. So when you look at the tier 2 eligibility, it would include any 24-hour report not filed before the election and was not reported on another statement unless the subject, contribution, or expenditure would have disclosed an advertiser or mass mailing paid for, and the mass mailing or advertisement failed to disclose the community name. So we wanted to make sure that we're excluding the reporting of an advertisement or mass mailing that also did not identify the committee. And then this is the full disclosure slide, I like to call it. So if the proposal is as we have suggested it, to consolidate those bottom cities and counties, then that would include 37 of the counties and 462 of the cities. That would be consolidated into those categories. If we go to the 11,700 limit, then it would only include 467,000. I wanted to make sure that you had all of the information because these are big numbers when you look at them. And it looks like, wow, we're including 499 out of 528 cities and counties in these lower populations into one size fits all kind of thing. But what we have found is that these limits are so low that they're not including the committees that the commission has instructed are the ones that they want to be included. First-time filers from small jurisdictions that don't have a ton of activity. And what we've also seen is that they spend a lot of their own money and they receive non-monetary contributions. And it's these non-monetary contributions that they receive in form of that should have been filed on a 24-hour report within 48 hours, and also are all within one period. So whereas a regular committee, their activity does peak before the election, in a smaller activity committee, they generally either all in the second pre-election period or the post semi-annual will have almost all of their activity. And so that's how they get disqualified from this limit. So I know these numbers seem like, well, it's a $16,700 committee, but it's usually a $18,000 committee that $16,750 of it was in one statement, which is how they get excluded. So I would urge to keep the limits higher in order to kind of get closer back to what our standard was for years of 25,000. And because I do think that that is the right result for these smaller committees. So again, full disclosure, we wanted to give you some examples so that you could really see the numbers. So case summary, unsuccessful candidate in a local election, the committee size was about 22,000 and they failed to timely file a campaign statement, a 24-hour report. The activity threshold for their population was 8,200. Their activity was 11,000. And so they got a mainline penalty of $4,000 and their streamline penalty would have been about $2,500. So it's similar in penalty and would have accomplished this case much quicker. And not necessarily the harm the commission is looking to get a full description of. All right, so this one was a successful candidate that spent 48,000 and the activity threshold for that jurisdiction was 8,200. And since they had statements over that, they actually paid a penalty of $9,000. Under the streamline, it would have been almost $5,700. So again, similar penalty when you're looking at, Commissioner Wilson, when you're looking at the fine structures and then if they work or not, I would encourage you to look at the examples. And I have detailed breakdowns of these examples as well that I can send you.
On that frame.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, on that frame, isn't the mainline penalty lower because of a practice we do of combining charges, combining counts, whereas on streamline, you're not allowed to combine counts?
This one is 9,000 and it had statements combined in it, even at the $9,000 level. And the 5685 does not have anything combined.
Right.
Right.
So this on the left, the mainline example, if you were not allowed to combine counts, it would have been much higher than 9,000. Right?
Yes, unless the commission would want to start having lower mainline penalties. The rule of thumb has generally been if a mainline penalty charge is less than $1,000, then why is it a mainline penalty? So the commission in general and enforcement in specific has generally only presented $1,000 as the lowest penalty for mainline.
Yeah, I would, myself, perceptually, I would rather in mainline, I'm just expressing my opinion here, I would rather eliminate the combining of counts, and to offset that in a general sense, charge less per count so that you get some consistency in terms of, because once you begin to combine counts, it provides for a lot of variability. Somebody gets off a lot lighter than they should. Somebody else pays the full freight. And I think part of our job, besides, smacking them on the hands for doing something wrong, is to provide them some sense that we're being fair and consistent. And when you have one case before you where they combine them down to what seems like a pretty small fine, the next one, there's less combining and the fine is bigger. And if you start really looking at what they did, it doesn't look right. And I've seen a number over the years that I just kind of go, oh my God. So that's just my opinion expressed. Take it for what it's worth.
Okay. I would hope that that's addressed because of the aggravating and mitigating circumstances that enforcement has been tasked to use. And so when we decide to combine cases or combine counts within a case, it's because of those circumstances that we're told to take into consideration in order to get to the penalty that the commission has kind of given us as a threshold for these types of cases. So that's why you do see the disparity based on the mitigating and all of the information from the factors, which is, which makes the pitch for tier 2, because that is the criteria with the matrix that has the less flexibility and applies the criteria evenly across the board. Mainline is meant to be a little squishier, that the commission reviews it and says, yeah, we agree that these are the factors that enforcement had to take into consideration, and this penalty is correct because of those factors. Okay, so then we have a successful candidate in a state primary, unsuccessful in general, 72,000. So this is an example of a state election. And the activity threshold was 23,900. Their activity was 28. So under mainline, they got a penalty of 3,000. Under the streamline as proposed, it would be 3,700-ish. And then here's the 24-hour restrictions. So this is a $9,000 unsuccessful candidate in a local election. They failed to file a 24-hour report receiving a $1,000 contribution. The contributor disclosed the contribution before the election. The exclusion was required to file in the last 16 days and not file before the election. So they got a mainline, and the streamline penalty would have been $430. A successful candidate in a local election for $17,000 worth of activity. They failed to file a pre-election and 4 24-hour reports. And so the exclusion was they filed by the committee, not filed within, and not reported on another statement. The contribution was received on October 18th, but wasn't reported till after the election. And so the streamline penalty would be very similar to the mainline penalty. And these are the proposed penalties for late contributions. And then just the recap of the decision points for the commission. Thank you. I really appreciate your patience.
Thank you, Ms. West. Do other commissioners have additional questions or comments for Ms. West? That was a lot of information, Ms. West. Well,
I really
well
just try to, overload you.
Mission accomplished. Commissioner Hatch.
I just again want to offset my pickiness with my congratulatory laudits to Galena West for the wonderful job she's done on this. And it's not easy. There's a lot of decision points, a lot of things to weigh in this, and I know that her heart is in the right place when she presents this stuff. And I again thank you very much for your hard work.
Thank you.
Ms. West, one aspect of your proposed changes, well, it's not included in your proposed changes. I know you and I spoke about this before, but for the benefit of the other commissioners, I really think that we're going in the right direction, expanding streamline here. I think one of your last slides really resonates with me, where you have a local candidate, and I think we popped them $1,500 for a relatively low-level violation. Under the expanded streamline, that would have been about $400. I think that's a lot more fair to local candidates, first-time candidates. But one thing that we don't have yet that I hope we pursue in the future is some form of a diversion program, where instead of somebody committing an inadvertent low-level violation, having to pay a penalty, a monetary penalty, which, $500 may seem light to us, but to a lot of folks, that's real money. That's a significant amount. And I think we would be perhaps better served in some circumstances by having a program where the penalty wasn't monetary. It was take a training that we offer and certify that you've completed a training in the area that they were, deficient in with respect to their reporting obligations, and try to drive up and encourage compliance in a collaborative way. I don't think beating people with progressive penalties repeatedly is necessarily always the right approach. And I think we need to be a little bit more creative in the future in how we look at this. I think that is something that we're going to have to develop over time. I'm not suggesting we flip a switch and we're there tomorrow, but I certainly would hope that we could spend some time in the next year and develop that type of sort of an add-on to the streamline expansion that you've already proposed. So assuming other commissioners feel likewise about such a program. I'm seeing nodding heads, which is always a good sign. All right. Any other commissioners wish to comment before we open up for public comment? Commissioner Hatch.
Just in furtherance of what you were suggesting, I know that when I was a young lobbyist, I saw cases go through where people had suspended portions of their fine based on future good behavior, and there were a number of other innovative ways that were tried. And I don't know the results of all those things, but they just seem to have gone by the way of the same as the buggy whip. They're gone. So I like to associate myself with your remarks about looking for ways to impose a penalty without it always being financial.
Great. All right, well, at this time, let's go ahead and open it up to public comment. Do we have any public comment on the phone lines or digitally on this item? Well, hearing it and seeing none, I imagine this is our pre-notice discussion, so I imagine we will receive additional public comment as the process unfolds here. Thank you, Ms. West. It was a great presentation. Certainly very educational for commissioners. So looking forward to you coming back to us at a future meeting.
Can I interrupt real quick? Can the commission give me guidance on the 4 policy decisions so I know we're on the right track, or at least on adding major donor and behested payments?
I don't see anybody objecting to that, and I didn't see that during the course of the discussion. I do think it was a lot of information presented for the first time, so I'd be reluctant to want us to give you any more direction at this point. I think we need to sit with this for a minute. Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I might.
Commissioner Cardenas.
Thank you very much. First, to echo my colleagues' commendations to Ms. West. And certainly those members of her team who worked on this. This is a tremendous amount of work. One gauge of that for me personally is the personal empirical significance of my ongoing headache. That's a lot. And my little brain is maxed out. I think I need to leave. You know what I'm saying? But I want to strongly support the addition of major donor committees, and in particular behested payments. News outlets up and down the state have been, I think, on behalf of the people, asking for more to be done in this regard. And so I'd be interested to see a more fine-tuned, granular analysis of how that might play out in the context of of a two-tiered streamlined system. My one question really for Ms. West, it has to do with staffing. It seems like in order to strike the balance in a two-tier streamline regime where staff is appropriately exercising some analytical discretion to understand egregious cases for what they are and treat them as such, but also to understand and appreciate the minor mistakes made by perhaps less experienced individuals operating on behalf of very small one-time only organizations. But it does require some real analysis and the addition of cases and issues that would not currently pass the filter of the existing streamline regime. And so I'm just wondering, Ms. West, what does this mean in terms of the load that your staff is already heroically dealing with?
It's actually a benefit because the great thing about the streamlined system that we put into place that Commissioner Hatch and I worked on forever is that what came of it is more of a checklist approach. So the staff has to go through and answer questions about every case. And they have to actually think about it and say, is this factor absent or present? Is this factor absent or present? And then they do a recommendation at the bottom. And then a second person always looks at that, which is me. And so we have a consistent treatment. And anytime that I flag that, hey, this isn't, your recommendation is off base based on your criteria, what we generally do is send it to the group and say, do other people also interpret these criteria the same way? And so we try to make sure that we have a lot of group interaction and make sure that everybody's interpreting the criteria the same way. Because it's not just about checking the box, it's understanding what checking the box means. And so I think that at first it was painful. It was, everybody was looking at these checklists and they're like, oh my God, streamline's impossible. How are we ever going to do this? Because we'd really outlined a lot of criteria and a lot of specifications as to what you need to move forward. And then now that they have the hang of it, they're like, oh yeah, you just do the streamline. You're like, you read this and you do this and you do this. And if you're confused about this, then you ask. And I think that it's actually facilitated discussion about cases more than ever because you have a specific thing to refer to as opposed to you're writing a memo, making a recommendation on a case. And so your criteria could be all over the place or not included. Lots of times I send memos back and say, you don't even have the size of the committee in here. You don't even have this or that. And so I think this program, as we've instituted, has really helped the staff to understand what they're analyzing and to flag issues. And so I think that tier 2 will even emphasize that more as we add more things to pay attention to and to look at.
Terrific, thank you. Mr. Chair, that's the only comment and question that I have other than to offer my most sincere thanks also to Commissioner Hatch for his yeoman's work in this area. Thank you, Mel.
Thank you, Commissioner Cardenas. All right, any other commissioners have comments on this item before we move on? Hearing and seeing none. I'd actually propose, with my colleagues' indulgence, that perhaps we take a 10-minute break and re-adjourn at 11 o'clock. Does that sound good? All right, guys, we'll see you back at 11 o'clock then. All right. Is everyone ready? Yes. All right. Sasha, good? Jesse, you good? All right. All right. We'll go ahead and reconvene now, and we'll move to item 12, This is our pre-notice discussion of amendments to Regulation 18703, Public Generally Exception. And my understanding is that we have General Counsel Bainbridge and Senior Commission Counsel Zachary Norton with us. Mr. Norton?
Good morning, Chair Maddox and Commissioners. So the Act prohibits a public official from making, participating in making, or attempting to influence a governmental decision if it is reasonably foreseeable that the decision will have a material financial effect on the official's financial interest, distinguishable from its effect on the public generally. This agenda item involves amendments to the conflict of interest regulations addressing how the public general exception is applied. The proposed amendments would clarify the application of the public general exception and improve the identification of potential conflicts of interest. Regulation 18703 explains the specific details for the rules for applying the public general exception. Subdivision A provides the general rule and a two-pronged test to establish if the effect of a decision on an official's financial interest is indistinguishable from its effect on the public generally. The first prong is to determine if a significant segment is affected, and the second prong is to ask if the effect on the official's financial interest is not unique compared to the effect on a significant segment. Once an official determines that a significant segment of the jurisdiction will be affected by the decision, the official is permitted to take part in the decision only so long as the decision does not have a unique effect on the official's interest in comparison to the significant segment. Subdivision B 1 through 3 provides detailed definitions of the term significant segment. A significant segment of the public is at least 25% of either all businesses or nonprofit entities, all real property, commercial real property, or residential real property, or all individuals within the official's jurisdiction. Subdivision C defines when a decision will have a unique effect on a public official's financial interest. Subdivision D provides a detailed definition of the term jurisdiction for purposes of determining the significant segment. Subdivision E sets out special circumstances when the effect on an official's financial interest will be deemed indistinguishable from that of the public generally and permit the official to participate. The current regulation was last amended in 2015 to address a historically narrow interpretation of the exception, which staff recognized made it nearly impossible for an official to show the exception applied. While the 2015 amendment was successful in broadening the scope of the exception and permitting some participation by public officials in decisions with broad effects on the public, there have been several issues with the adopted language and other opportunities identified for extending the exception since its last amendment. This proposal is intended to give the Commission the ability to review the 2015 amendment to determine its effectiveness and identify further clarifications. Proposed revisions to Regulation 18703 seek to expand the public generally exception in instances where the only relevant interest is in an official's primary residence and further clarify the application of the special circumstances exceptions provided by the regulation. And we'll address each of these proposals in turn. Proposed amended subdivision B2 creates a lower 15% threshold for residential real property within the official's jurisdiction for instances where the only interest affected is the official's residence. And property interests have typically had an objective and clearer bright line rule for determining disqualification than business interests. As a result, officials with property interests are more likely to be disqualified from a governmental decision merely because of the distance of the official's property from the property affected by the decision than an official who has a business interest operating in the same vicinity. Moreover, an official with an interest in a primary residence is not attempting to further business interests in engaging in decisions that are likely to have cumulative benefits to the jurisdiction. Further, officials are elected to represent the interests of their neighborhood and neighbors, and a narrow application of the public general exception may unnecessarily prohibit officials from serving the interest of their constituents. Accordingly, staff makes this proposed amendment to broaden the public general exception as applied to officials where only their primary residence is affected by the decision. and it's aimed at addressing concerns where officials with merely a residence are too often disqualified from broad decisions concerning matters such as community development and building standards for flood and fire protection. And this is an issue that has been raised several times with me dealing with letters, and there's people that, council members that have explained that they were elected in part to deal with concerns in the hillside community over fire protection, and that they feel like their constituents are missing out if they're not able to participate. So proposed amendment subdivision E adds the requirement that there be no unique effect on the official's interest to the beginning of the subdivision. The existing regulation includes the no unique effect language in the special circumstances exceptions found in E5 through 7, but does not specifically state the language in subdivisions E1 through 4. In applying these exceptions, staff has determined that no unique effect requirement is equally relevant for all of the special circumstances exceptions, and that an official may not take part in a decision where there is a unique effect on the official's interest. This amendment will make it clear that this requirement is applicable to all exceptions enumerated in subdivision E. Proposed amended subdivision E1 make it clear that an official may not take part in a decision to impose an assessment, tax, or fee, or determine the boundaries of property or groups of persons subject to the assessment, tax, or fee, and is only permitted to take part in establishing and adjusting the actual assessment, tax, or fee once the decision to create it has been made without that official's participation. The existing regulation states that the exception applies to establishing an assessment, tax, or fee, which has introduced some uncertainty into the interpretation of the exception. As determined by staff, the exception applies only to setting the tax or fee, applies to setting the tax only after the tax has been authorized and the property or persons subject to the tax have been determined. Staff has maintained that this exception does not allow an official to take part in the decision as to whether a new assessment, tax, or fee will apply to the official or the official's business or property. Proposed amended subdivision E3 provides a minimum size for the definition under limited neighborhood effects. The financial effect on a public official's financial interest is deemed indistinguishable from that of the public generally if the official establishes the decision affects residential real property limited to a specific location. The term specific location is somewhat vague, and the existing regulation could arguably be asserted to apply to a single street or group of homes. This amendment establishes a bright line minimum size of neighborhood to which the exception would apply. The proposed minimum size for the neighborhood is more than 50 or 5% of residential real properties in this jurisdiction, whichever is less. The proposed amended subdivision E4 permits officials to take part in certain broad rent control decisions and tenant protection measures, which apply to all rentals except those exempted by the Costa-Hawkins Rental Control Act if the official owns 3 or fewer residential units. The removal of an express exception allowing officials to take part in rent control decisions where the decision applied to all rental properties and the official had 3 or 4 rental units was an unintended consequence of adopting the existing regulation. In removing the express exception in 2015, staff anticipated that most rental decisions would fall within the basic public general exception of subdivision A because rental properties make up 25% or more of residential properties in most jurisdictions. However, it was not anticipated that due to the Costa-Hawkins Rental Control Act's exclusion of large categories of properties from rent control decisions, that the exception would not apply once rentals excluded by state law were removed from that calculation. As proposed, this amendment clarifies the application of the public general exception in the context of rent control and similar decisions where the official owns 3 or fewer rental units, and the decision will apply to all rentals to which the ordinance can apply under state law. And then with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Do commissioners have questions for Mr. Norton? Commissioner Hatch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have submitted some suggested changes, most of which I see are incorporated in a revised set of amendments, and I thank you for that. There were a couple of threshold issues that is just me about, like for instance, on page 1, line 8, I suggested change the number 25 to 50. I think those are have percent signs behind them. And also page 1, line 13, change 15 to 30. I don't think there's any science behind either the existing number or the other one. And my only defense here is that because public generally can be broken down into segments of the community, it gets down to a pretty small threshold of what would be considered to be considered public generally. And so I would just ask, as we move from now until the full hearing, that staff gets a chance to kind of cogitate on my suggestions in that area and let me know what they think about it. Thank you. And now I'm going to make my switchy changey act here. Thank you.
All right. Commissioner Hatch will be leaving the Zoom meeting, but resuming his participation by telephone shortly. Mr. Norton, I had a couple questions for you. The first question is, did we receive input from stakeholders, and particularly I'm thinking about local governments who are mostly impacted by these aspects of our regulations. Have they weighed in on this? Have you consulted with them? And if so, what's their feedback been?
Yes, we did receive some feedback from the League of Cities. Generally, they were very supportive of the new 15% threshold for residential real property. And I think that goes back to an issue that has been raised by elected officials with me, and as well as by city attorneys, saying that there are certain circumstances where it's a flood or fire protection measure and it's only the official's residence that's being affected. And then there's sort of that pushback that they have this concern that maybe the constituents in the hillside area that's subject to the regulation won't have their voice heard. So the league has been supportive of the 15% threshold, and I think they're happy with that language as proposed.
All right, thank you. And then the second question I had for you, on page 3, line 19, it's paragraph B, the official owns 3 or fewer residential rental units. And this is more of a lawyerly question for you, Mr. Norton, but do we define what a residential rental unit is? I mean, is that the entire building? Or if I own a building and it has 10 rental units in it, have I already exceeded that threshold?
I think if it's the latter, I believe you have exceeded the threshold. I think what we're talking about is 3 separate units that could be rented out. So maybe
do we specify that anywhere in the regs to make that clear?
I don't know that we do. I think we could certainly add language to that subdivision that makes it clear that we're talking about a building with 3 apartments or 3 separate properties or something along those lines.
Right. And by the way, I agree with your sort of gut interpretation of how that should be interpreted. But if we haven't said it, I do think it leaves it open for debate, and we may be better served to try and just tighten that up with a definition. Okay. Do other commissioners have questions, comments for Mr. Norton? All right, at this point, let's go ahead and open it up to public.
Mr. Chairman,
Commissioner Hatch?
Yes, I'd forgotten to ask a question about the reference to immediate family. Do we have an existing regulation that defines the immediate family that would apply to this?
Actually, that is defined in the Act, and immediate family is defined under section 82029, and it means spouse and dependent children.
Okay, so it is covered. Thank you. That's all.
Yeah.
All right, then at this time, let's go ahead and open it up to public comment. Is there any public comment on the telephone on item 12? Hearing none. And seeing no digital public comment, this is on pre-notice. So Mr. Norton, thank you very much for your presentation, and we look forward to taking this up at a future meeting.
Well, thank you, Chair Matich and Commissioners.
Thank you. All right, at this point, we will continue on and move to item 13. This is an amendment and repeal of various regulations due to statutory changes. Again, we have General Counsel Bainbridge and Commission Counsel Matthew Christie. Mr. Christie, welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. Matthew Christie here on behalf of the Legal Division to present technical and non-substantive revisions to Commission regulations to harmonize those regulations with changes to the Political Reform Act resulting from the recent enactment of AB 902 and AB 903, both of which were sponsored by the Commission. Of these revisions, the most significant is the amendment of Regulation 18422.5. This is the Commission's regulation governing certain committees' submission and maintenance of top 10 contributor lists. The proposed update would comport that regulation with changes to Section 84223 made by AB 902. AB 902 amended Section 84223 in order to accommodate the completion of the Secretary of State's CARS project, replace Cal Access. CARS is scheduled to be implemented in February of 2021, and a recent update on the project has indicated that CARS may enable the repeal of this regulation at that time, because CARS should be able to generate and administrate top 10 contributor lists autonomously. Under Regulation 18431, a sub-vendor payment to a firm or business entity that is paid to provide canvassing, door-to-door solicitation, or signature gathering is a reportable campaign expense. The proposed update would amend Regulation 18431 to codify recently issued formal written advice, clarifying that a committee is not required to report the name of an individual canvasser, door-to-door solicitor, or signature gatherer who works as an independent contractor for a vendor. This clarification would not affect the applicability of the Act's reporting requirements to either vendors or sub-vendors, including the independent contractors who work directly for a committee. And the Enforcement Division does not foresee this clarification affecting Commission investigators' ability to obtain information relating to potential violations of the Act. The proposed update would also make other conforming and non-substantive changes to Commission regulations to improve their clarity and guidance. And the proposed update is explained in further detail in the Commission memo. With that, I'd be happy to address any questions Commissioners may have about the proposed update. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Christie. Do Commissioners have any questions for Mr. Christie? Hearing and seeing none. Do we have, Commissioner Wilson.
Mr. Christie, just want to thank you, Mr. Bainbridge, and all the staff for their hard work on this regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wilson.
All right, do we have any public comment on item 13? This is amendment and repeal of various regulations due to statutory changes. Hearing and seeing none. These changes are before us today for adoption. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Do we have a second? Motion and a second. Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Cardenas?
Yes.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Christie.
Thank you, Chair.
All right, we'll now proceed to item 14. This is our legislative development report, such as it is. Again, we have General Counsel Bainbridge and Mr. Wairinga, Communications Director. Mr. Wairinga, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. Jay Wairinga, Communications Director. The legislative report as submitted. There are no changes other than AB 2151 will be heard August 4th in Senate elections. But if you've been reading the media reports, Again, committee chairs are asking most members to limit their bills to only COVID-related and budget-related things. So report as submitted.
Thank you, Mr. Wairinga. Do commissioners have any questions for Mr. Wairinga at this point? Hearing none. Do we have any public comment on item 14? Hearing and seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Wairinga. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, we'll move to item 15, our committee updates, which will be very brief because we did not have any committee meetings this past month. Due to the surge in COVID cases, we made the determination that we were going to push the meetings to either later this month or early next month. So that is our plan. And I suspect in the next few days, we'll start noticing those committee meetings so we can get back on track. So that's the committee report. Moving to item 16, our executive staff reports. Begin with the Enforcement Division, Chief of Enforcement West.
It's as submitted. Nothing new to report. Everybody just keep on keeping on.
All right. Any questions for Ms. West? Any public comment on Ms. West's report? Hearing and seeing none. Thank you, Ms. West. Mr. Bainbridge, the Legal Division report.
Yeah, Dave Bainbridge, General Counsel. Just a couple quick notes. We're up and running on the phones. We had to shut down for a couple days due to the surging cases that the chair mentioned earlier, but we're able to get the people who are running the phones. They're now able to do that through the internet at their homes, thanks to our IT staff here. So if you have a question and you call the number, you should talk to someone. It just might sound a little funny because they're talking to you over the internet. And then I also wanted to just commend our email advice group. With all the things going on, what we've been able to say is you can always get through to email advice as long as you have an internet connection and an email address. So they've picked up a lot of the slack and gotten a lot of questions. And we still have an election coming up, and it's not too far away, so they're ramping up. But I just wanted to give them some credit for all the work they've done. And you look at their numbers, and it's pretty impressive on how often they respond to an email request within 24 hours. Other than that, as submitted.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Bainbridge. Commissioners have questions or comments for Mr. Bainbridge? Hearing and seeing none. Any public comment for Mr. Bainbridge on his report? Hearing and seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Bainbridge. Moving on to the Admin Technology Division report, Ms. Hahn, our Acting Executive Director and Director of Admin.
I have nothing. The report is submitted, but I would like to echo my general counsel. In extension, I wanted to commend all the staff that's been working during this difficult time. We know how challenging it is to try to work at home, but we made it work. So I just wanted to commend everyone's hard effort in the office.
Thank you, Ms. Hahn. Any questions for Ms. Hahn on her report from commissioners? Hearing and seeing none. Any public comment on Ms. Hahn's report? Hearing and seeing none. And last but not least, Ms. Hahn, do you have anything additional to add for the Executive Director report in your capacity as Acting Executive Director?
No, again, like I said earlier, I just want to commend all the hard work the staff has contributed to the department while they're working at home. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hahn. Any further questions for Ms. Hahn? Public comment? Thank you, everybody. Well, at this point, that concludes the majority of our public calendar. At this time, the Commission will adjourn into closed session for item 17 for discussion of a personnel matter.
Mr. Chairman, we have a phone number to call in. Is that how we're doing it?
Yes, Commissioner Hatch. I believe our Commission Assistant has provided that number, and she can provide it to you again if need be.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We're going to, I don't need to use the number exactly, yeah. Oh, I know we got 30 seconds, right? Something I wanted to point out to you. Well, I mean, you can do the same thing I do, I just have to pan off and you and I are up here. Maybe they just pan, you can pan into us more closely to us on the audience, right? Yeah, whatever works, I just think that in the chair. You're not here, you go, you just look at the main visual. Yeah, I think, so whatever you want, whatever works, I'm open to. I think that's, yeah, no, I would, I think my preference is, especially if you're here, is just have them stand closer to you and I. Well, more importantly, folks standing closer to you. Yeah. No, I'm just, you know, I'm big on protocol. Yeah. I mean, there's no, you know, I have, you know, no reason to curry favor with you. I look at the screen, I'm like, he should be highlighted. So anyway, that's my, this is my observation. All right. Where are my kids off? And there was a commission hearing in San Diego. It was a really close shot. It was in Sacramento City Council. It was a close shot. So there's a way to do it.
They can still,
Yeah, well, add it to the list.
is that mic off? Okay.
I'll go up there.
Just,
All right, we are going to reconvene now out of closed session, and we have an announcement out of closed session, and we are very, very pleased to announce that Galena West, our current Chief of Enforcement, has accepted our offer to become our new Executive Director. And so we all welcome Galena into her new position as Executive Director, and that will be effective August 15th, 2020. Now, the complication, of course, with elevating Galena is that it creates a potential vacancy in the Chief of Enforcement seat. And so we have a transition plan that we've discussed. We've consulted with the General Counsel. And between August 15th and shortly after the November election, Ms. West will concurrently serve as both Executive Director and the Chief of Enforcement, subject to a number of delegations, which we will make public by way of memo after this meeting. And the purpose there, of course, is there are legal restrictions on somebody holding both of those positions simultaneously. She cannot be on both sides of cases that come before us. So we've thought about that. We have a plan, and we will ensure that that does not happen. After the November election, we hope that by that point we have recruited and hired a new Chief of Enforcement who will then take over that position, and Ms. West will be permitted to serve as just the Executive Director going forward. So congratulations, Ms. West. And I want to take this opportunity to thank, as much as I possibly can, Ms. Hahn for yet again stepping into the role as acting Executive Director while also handling her current obligations as Director of Administration. Ms. Hahn, we really could not function as an agency without you. Your work is appreciated beyond words, and just thank you very much for your work during this transition. So those are our announcements out of closed session. At this point, we have one item left, and that is item 18, Commissioner comments for proposed future agenda items. Do any commissioners wish to comment on item 18? Hearing and seeing none, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn?
Second.
Motion and a second. Ms. Linker.
Commissioner Cardenas?
Aye.
Commissioner Hatch?
Aye.
Commissioner Hayward?
Yes.
Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Chair Madich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Have a safe and healthy weekend, and see you soon. Bye.